Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, America's citadel of free speech for 99 years. My name is Nicole Braden Lewis, and I am a member of the City Club Special Programs Committee. For many individuals in polite society, talking about money is awkward and difficult, even and particularly when it comes to things we really care about. We all know that the important civic, cultural, and religious organizations we so esteem need our money to survive, but we hesitate to ask our friends and colleagues for gifts to our beloved alma maters, churches, and other nonprofit groups, such as the City Club. Figured out how to ask for money. It is the largest organization in the world. Just last week, the Catholic Diocese of Cleveland kicked off a capital campaign aiming to raise $1.25 million over the next year and a half. According to the Plain Dealer, an honorary campaign co-chair made sure to state that none of the money raised will go toward legal costs associated with clergy sex abuse cases. So where does the money go? What happens to your offering in the plate on Sunday? Today's speaker at the City Club of Cleveland is Jason Berry, investigative journalist and filmmaker, and author of the new book, Render Unto Rome, The Secret Life of Money in the Catholic Church. The book is for sale today in our lobby. Mr. Berry is already well known for his shocking 1992 expose titled Lead Us Not into Temptation, Catholic Priests and the Sexual Abuse of Children. Any one of us who channels our passions through an organization, a house of worship, a college, a social services organization, can learn something from the way Mr. Berry, himself a Catholic, is unafraid to criticize his own church and call loudly upon it to change. You may be surprised that much of his latest book, about the largest organization in the world, is set in Cleveland. Mr. Berry, who lives in New Orleans, has researched here extensively. He knows us pretty well. Render Unto Rome even quotes Bishop Anthony Pilla's 1996 speech at this very podium. Now, this is Mr. Berry's turn to speak here at the City Club of Cleveland. Please join me in extending a warm City Club welcome to Jason Berry.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And let me first say, as a citizen of New Orleans, how grateful I am, and all of us are, for the many churches in the Midwest, particularly in Ohio, who journeyed south to help in the cleanup after Hurricane Katrina. It was rather breathtaking to see so many churches come with people who went into these flooded homes and helped to cart out old posts with nails to gut them, so that people had a better chance to rebuild their homes. I am also reminded whenever I journey out to foreign countries like New York or Boston or Cleveland that we have a rather extravagant political tradition in Louisiana. I'm just going to use 1 second as an advertisement for a book I did in 2006 called Last of the Red Hot Papas, which is a comic novel about Louisiana. It's the only way you can write about it. And the Cajun governor, on whom that book is loosely based, recently surrendered his endowed chair in a federal penitentiary and is now back among the living. And so it is a great pleasure to be in Ohio, where democracy is clean. Thank you. My assignment when I agreed to do this book from Trace Murphy, the director of religious publishing at Doubleday, was really very simple and quite frightening. He said, I have an image. A woman puts $1 in the Sunday collection plate. Tell me where it goes. And I looked at him, and in the time-honored manner of an investigative journalist, I said, of course. Having no idea how I would. This book is not a financial anatomy of the Catholic Church, because to try and explain all of the assets and even conjecture a net worth for the oldest church in Christendom, and indeed the largest organization in the world, would be futile. What I have done instead is follow the money, if you will, through a series of narrative chapters that are loosely focused, even though they are in different parts of the country with intervening chapters in Rome, on the underlying theme, which is the lack of a justice system in the Catholic Church. And that, in my judgment, after many years of working on the abuse cases, on the reporting of them, and now on the financial chaos, that to me is the great reform that the Church needs to institute. The book follows a group of people in Boston, Cleveland, Los Angeles, and New Orleans, almost like a different cast of characters in each of these dioceses. And the sort of unifying thread is how parishes are closed and the enormous power that bishops have in using the funds at their disposal. Every bishop has two inherent roles, apart from the historical roles of being both a moral teacher and a defender of the poor and the immigrants. In the United States, where we are, of course, nationally a melting pot, the Catholic bishops in the latter half of the 19th century through the World War II years were viewed as protectors of the immigrant peoples coming to the United States and as champions of the poor. And although some of what I have to say today is extremely critical of the way the Church is governed financially, I just want to put out on the table at the outset that Catholic Charities USA is absolutely pivotal to the social safety net of the United States of America, and so is Catholic Charities, not just of Cleveland, but every other city. These are services to the poor. These are part of the mission and the historic role of this church, and indeed of many others. And so, in putting forth a critique of how the church is governed financially, I have been ever mindful of the need for institutions such as Catholic Charities, and indeed for the historic role of the church in helping the poor. I want to give you just a few cameos of information that really caught my attention as I went along the road of this research. The first is Peter's Pence. Peter's Pence is the donation that is taken every year toward the end of June in Catholic parishes across the developed world. And it is advertised as a donation for the charitable uses of the Holy Father in Rome. In 2009, Peter's Pence took in about $82.5 million. Considering the recession, the tightening of the global credit, that's a pretty substantial donation. Pope Benedict last year donated $250,000 to rebuild a school that had been demolished in the terrible earthquake in Haiti. And that's exactly what papal philanthropy should be about. That is what we expect of a pope. I spent a great deal of time trying to get an accurate accounting of where Peter's Pence funds were used. And I could only get documentation on about 8.5 million of the 82.5. So for most of this money, we don't really know how the Holy See used it. I'm not saying it was misused, we just don't know where it went. What I did learn over many months of doing scholarly research in the library is that for most of the last century, Peter's Pence was used, at least in part, to plug the Vatican operating deficit. The Holy See has an operating budget of roughly $280 million a year, much smaller than that of the city of Cleveland, certainly smaller than that of the flood-battered city of New Orleans, which was at about $450 right after Katrina. So even with a budget this small, there were clearly financial problems going back across the last century. And I have a long section on the 19th century figure of Pius IX, Pio Nono, who self-declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican because he was furious at the Italian unification movement, Risorgimento as it was called, because of the loss of the papal states. This is a huge agricultural territory that basically runs up the middle of the Italian peninsula. And even though the prime minister of the new combined state and the king both wanted to guarantee funds to the Holy See every year if the Pope would become, in essence, the spiritual monarch of this new unified country, he excommunicated the king and said that he would never set foot across the Tiber Bridge again until he got his money. He died not before declaring himself infallible by a vote of the bishops from around the world. And as I say in the book, infallibility proved to have silver lining because there arose across the world this mistaken impression that the Pope can never make a mistake about anything. And it had a huge effect on international fundraising and philanthropy. And so while he was a prisoner of the Vatican, his Secretary of State was investing in real estate in Rome, which was booming because they were building a parliament and all these buildings to house legislators, parliamentarians, and the like. This book begins in Boston with a man named Peter Boret, who is a most unlikely reformer, a retired oil man, never had any idea of joining a group like Call to Action or Voice of the Faithful. And he got mad when his parish closed in 2004. And he started looking around. He had the advantage of a Harvard MBA and being fluent in Italian because he had grown up in Italy, where his father was an official with a lawyer affiliated with the Marshall Plan. And so the book follows Peter Boret as he tries to understand the finances of Boston, goes to Rome, and files a series of appeals in 2 offices. And these are very important to understand. The Congregation for the Clergy is one of 9 Vatican offices that essentially function as, in a roughly analogous way, cabinet-level offices surrounding the Pope. Each of these 9 congregations is led by a cardinal who report to the Pope. Congregation for the Clergy is very important because the 3rd office of the Congregation for the Clergy is in charge of oversight of the liquidation of property and assets in dioceses across the world. And we're mainly talking about the developed world. The bishops in 2002, when they adopted the Youth Protection Charter at their meeting in Dallas, a very important document, although it has not been followed perfectly, I think on paper does hold promise for reform. Nonetheless, at that meeting, they adopted a position that the Vatican soon ratified so that any diocese, any bishop who wants to sell property is pretty much operating freely under a threshold of $5 million for small dioceses and $11.3 million for large metropolitan dioceses or archdioceses. Summer of 2003, cardinal law has left, and the incoming Archbishop, Sean O'Malley, having been appointed to Boston, previously in Palm Beach, Florida, goes to Rome, and he is facing a dual crisis. There are 552 abuse victims whose attorneys are in court negotiating hard, and O'Malley has to raise money to pay for those settlements. And he has learned that cardinal law has basically bequeathed a financial sinkhole. Now, I'm giving this to you in a bit of a colloquial sense, but the book has about 40 pages of footnotes. I had translations from the Latin and the Italian. My Spanish is pretty good, but I even got a little help there. So what I'm telling you is a very abbreviated version, but please do not think that this is fiction in any way. O'Malley meets in the summer of '03 with 2 very powerful cardinals, Angelo Sodano, who at that time was the Secretary of State under John Paul II, and Cardinal Dario Castrillon Hoyos from Colombia, who was the prefect of the Congregation for Clergy. And basically they said to O'Malley, look, we have great sympathy. We understand you're in a crisis, but we cannot give you money. That's out of the question. What we can do is give you carte blanche to sell whatever you need to sell. And so O'Malley goes back to Boston, where he has been presented the blueprint for what is called reconfiguration. and that was done by Bishop Richard Lennon, who was then his assistant. The problem in Boston, and I'm going to get back to the Vatican in just a moment, but the problem in Boston is that from 1986 until 2002, the Clergy Pension Fund was an annual donation by the good Catholics of Boston to support priests in their retirement and in their needs. Every year across that 16-year period, the $4.5 million was not invested at a time when the market was yielding about 5%. And instead of building up an aggregate fund, in addition to the funds they already had, the money was spent. Bishop Lennon was basically Cardinal Law's right hand. They spent heavily on the needs of priests who had been removed for abusing children, including pensions for them. And they also spent substantially in negotiating settlements with abuse victims who were then pledged under the agreement never to speak publicly about how much they got. And that is how things were until 2001, when the Boston Globe filed suit and got access to the personnel files of all of these priests. And just to keep this in context, that never happened in Cleveland. Because of the grand jury, the secrecy, the district attorney's opinion here, and the decision of the judge, those files were never released in Cleveland. Therefore, Cleveland never had the huge abuse settlements that Boston had. So Lennon's plan was to use the canonical device known as suppression. Under suppression, a bishop can take title to any church and its cash assets, its cash reserves, and do with it what he wishes. I am convinced that suppression is an issue that is destined for heavy litigation in this country, precisely over the issue of church and state, because, in my mind, not as an attorney, but as a journalist who has followed this most carefully, it is a new area of unsettled law. Let me give you one small example among many I could cite. Out in the heartland of this state, in the Farm Belt, is the town of Kansas, Ohio. There is a parish called St. James, Kansas. When they were suppressed by Bishop Leonard Blair, they had about $78,000 in cash reserves. The bishop, under his power, canonically, took control of the parish and the cash reserves. The parishioners protested, raised about $100,000, fought it legally all the way up to the federal level in Columbus, and lost. The bishop used their cash reserves to pay his attorney, and then after the decision, he demolished the church. This is the power that bishops have. In contrast, in Springfield, Massachusetts, a federal judge ruled that the bishop could close a church, but did not have the power to demolish it because it was a historic landmark. Okay, one final note on Boston. Our Lady Star of the Sea was one of the parishes closed, and while Bishop Lennon was the interim administrator, after Law resigned and before O'Malley arrived, he approved, according to a judge who did a special report on this parish, he approved the sale of the parish for $800,000 to a commercial photographer who within a month sold it for $2.6 million. It was a classic flip with a classic absence of oversight. We need a justice system in this church to oversee issues of property, much less the abuse cases. The problem in the Catholic Church is that bishops and cardinals are immune from punishment within the church. What happened in Rome after O'Malley left is, to me, an example of the crisis in the church at its most extreme. Cardinal Sodano, the Secretary of State, installed, with his power, in Cardinal Castrion's dicastery or congregation, one Monsignor Giovanni Carew. And among his other responsibilities, Monsignor Carew fed information on closed churches to Cardinal Sodano's nephew, Andrea Sodano, a building engineer in Italy. And everything I am recounting for you right now comes from the FBI and information that I got under the Freedom of Information Act. Andrea Sodano was vice president of a company based in New York called the Folieri Group. And the namesake, president of the company, Raffaello Folieri, and I must pause here and say that even as an investigative journalist, God does not give you characters like Folieri very often. He came out of Central Casting, tousled brown hair, 27 years old, cherubic cheeks, the dark eyes, high-octane romance with Anne Hathaway, the movie star, Devil Wears Prada, Princess Diaries. He was only paying $37,000 a month rent for his apartment at Olympic Tower in New York City. And of course, he had lined up investors in his company, with Andrea Sodano going around, flipping open the cell phone, showing them photographs of Uncle Angelo in his robes back in Rome. Cardinal Sodano attended the launch party in New York for this company. And there was a third functionary, besides Andrea and Monsignor Carew, in the Vatican named Tenio Maniero, who works in the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints, the office that makes saints. According to the FBI, he had $387,000 wired directly to him in the Vatican Bank, and Andrea Sodano had $800,000 wired to him on invoices that Theodore Cacciopi, the FBI agent I interviewed at length, said on the record were worthless. Now, when the investors sued Folieri, the Wall Street Journal did a piece and the FBI started to inquire. And Folieri soon was convicted and sent to prison. He is still serving a prison term. The FBI considers Cardinal Sodano's nephew and Monsignor Carew and Tenio Maniero to be unindicted co-conspirators. While all of this was happening, 5 parishes in Boston had protested their closing, and 7 years later there are still good Catholics sleeping in the pews of those parishes in asserting their own rights as beneficiaries of their parishes in the belief that the sacred space in which they worshiped was something that the bishop did not have the right to close. One of the things that is so fascinating to me about the third office of the Congregation for the Clergy is that it is charged with respecting the rights of the beloved dead. That those Catholics who have given land and art and great fortunes or small amounts of money over the years that a parish has used should be honored even though they are no longer with us. Well, in my judgment, Cardinal Sodano violated those standards within the Catholic Church, grandly so. Imagine, too, for argument's sake, if Condoleezza Rice, when she was Secretary of State, or Hillary Clinton today, and this is purely conjecture, but imagine if an American Secretary of State were to contact an international real estate company and say, look, because of terrorism, we're getting ready to sell some properties in the Arab world so that we can build stronger, more fortified embassies and compounds. Would you like to know what the properties are? That is the equivalent here. There's one other point on Cardinal Sodano I want to make. In 1998, a gentleman from Mexico City, Jose Barba, a college professor with a doctorate from Harvard in Latin American affairs, went to the Vatican with another man and filed a case in Cardinal Ratzinger's congregation calling for the ouster, the excommunication, of Father Marcial Maciel. Father Maciel was the greatest fundraiser of the modern church. Despite the French surname, he was from Mexico, and he was absolutely brilliant at going into a room of the most conservative donors imaginable and working that room like a senator with silk between his fingers. Colleges, universities, seminaries on 3 continents, a $650 million operating budget. 9 men, accused him of having abused them as seminarians years ago in Rome and Spain. Now, these are men that Gerald Renner, my late colleague on the previous book that I did, Vows of Silence, interviewed in great depth for a report in 1997 in the Hartford Courant. And the book that we did in 2004, Vows of Silence, and the film I later produced is based on that book, is the story of how 2 popes had to deal with Father Maciel. And the man between those popes was Angelo Sodano, the Secretary of State. John Paul II looked at Maciel as a sort of charismatic figure who was taking the church to a new level because of these ultra-Orthodox young men, double-breasted blazers, tight haircuts, walking 2 by 2 across St. Peter's Square. Maciel gave an enormous amount of money to the Vatican. And in this book, I quote several of the priests who have since left that order, talking about the cash payments to Cardinal Sodano. Cardinal Sodano immediately put pressure on Cardinal Ratzinger to leave the case alone once it was filed, and for 6 years, nothing happened on that case. We need a justice system in this church. In 2004, with John Paul in failing health, Cardinal Ratzinger, perhaps sensing that he might soon become Pope, 6 months later, or easily realizing that whoever would become Pope could not enter that esteemed and holy position with a notorious pedophile being not prosecuted. And so he opened an investigation. Even after the investigation continued, Cardinal Sodano's office issued a press statement saying the process has been done. And the Vatican press office was forced to back up the Secretary of State when in fact it was not true at all. Cardinal Ratzinger, in his famous speech, homily, sermon, in the conclave before the cardinals retired to elect the Pope, scored the dictatorship of moral relativism. And he was talking about Europe and the tremendous drop-off in mass attendance in many European countries. And the centerpiece of his papacy was really to re-evangelize Europe. He has also been, arguably, the best Pope we've ever had on the abuse issue, and I say that with some caution, because John Paul, God bless his memory, was terrible on the issue. Simply ignored it, could not confront it for years and years and years. Well, Benedict becomes Pope. He begins meeting with survivors. He removed Maciel from the active ministry, banished him, basically. And then in 2010, the abuse crisis blew up in Europe, as I'm sure many of you saw in the news last summer. Hans Kung, the famous European theologian, one of many theologians punished by Cardinal Ratzinger during the period when he was dealing with theologians, called him the Grand Inquisitor. Of course, that's the character in Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, and in one of the most famous scenes of Western literature, the Inquisitor comes to Sevilla during the Inquisition, and there in a prison cell is Christ. And he lectures him, saying, "We don't need you. Leave it to us, the people in control, to give the suffering masses some sense of magic and a supernatural idea about their souls." He has lost his faith, the Inquisitor has. And then, in this powerful scene, Jesus stands, hugs him, kisses him on the face, and then leaves the room without saying the word, any word at all. I do not believe that the Pope, like the Inquisitor, has lost his faith, but he needs an inquisitor, because the prosecutions that have gone unexecuted are building, whether it's in the area of the abuse cases that have been covered up so terribly or the gross misuse of property. Cardinal Sodano is the face of corruption in this church. He is the dean of the College of Cardinals, and yet he should not be in a position of authority. The problem is the logic of apostolic succession. The idea that once a man becomes a bishop, he is literally in the spiritual lineage with the apostles of Jesus. The problem is that they have forgotten the lesson of Judas. We are all fallible, we are all sinners, and yet the church, which is trying desperately to revive the spiritual imagination of Europe, and trying indeed to maintain some tie with the younger generations of Americans today, who look at the denunciation of gay people and see the friends that they have on college campuses and ask themselves why. These are underlying realities that the Church of Rome must face alongside that hubris of apostolic succession, where men cannot be punished and have a de facto immunity from justice. After the terrible convulsions in Boston of the parish closings, Archbishop, now Cardinal O'Malley, issued a letter saying that he woke up one morning so distraught about reconfiguration that he wished it was his last breath. He literally said in this letter, "I wake up in mornings wishing that I could be taken by my Maker." Soon along, Bishop Lennon left. Bishop Lennon has practiced canon law for many years. He does not have a degree in canon law. He is an untrained canonist. He brought reconfiguration here to Cleveland, and I think all of you know what the results have been. I am mindful of the fundraising campaign in this diocese, and I'm here by coincidence. The book publication in no way was planned, or my trip here, because of the fundraising effort. But you know, there are only 3 dioceses, and I only have about 2 minutes left. There are only 3 dioceses that issue truly audited financial statements. Boston, which has run a staggering deficit for many years, and now has $100 million in unfunded pension liability. Kalamazoo, Michigan, and Los Angeles, the largest and wealthiest. The transparency in this city, which fascinated me because of the history of Catholic Charities here, which has a budget 3 times that of Boston. Catholic Charities of Cleveland is one of the most important social service agencies in the United States, much less in Cleveland. I'm not saying much to people in this room, I realize. But I think if we are going to restore and reform the church, those of us who are Catholic, with our friends from other faiths or people who simply recognize the need for support of this kind in a city like Cleveland, which is struggling with the demographic lurches and changes that many cities, New Orleans among them, has had, we need capable leadership and financial transparency. So I don't want to end on a note that would suggest an ad hominem attack against Bishop Lennon, but the reality is he came here because of a clerical system that rewards people regardless of performance. And I think we indeed need to take to heart and remember the words of St. Augustine, justice is that virtue that gives everyone his due. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a special program featuring Jason Berry, author of Render unto Rome, The Secret Life of Money in the Catholic Church. We will return momentarily for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate questions now and remind you that your questions should please be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here, especially those who are guests. We hope you will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. This Wednesday, June 22nd, the City Club welcomes Patrick Brissett, Associate Program Director of Public Works, the Demas Center for the Public Sector. This Friday, the City Club will host a conversation about sleep, how much we need, and what happens when we don't get it. If you wish to make reservations or order a CD or DVD of today's program, please call 1-888-223-6786 or 216-621-0082. Now we return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphone today are City Club Special Program Co-Chair Ellie Sullivan and City Club Program Director Carrie Miller. Now our first question, please.
Hi, can I start it off? Please, Jason, would you go back to the start of your talk? Did you ever find out where that $1 that goes into the collection plate ends up? Does it stay in that local town, or does it make its way to Rome?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that. Roughly sketch, it goes like this. Most of the money goes to the parishes, but this is an enormous amount of money, $7.5 billion a year. And in every diocese, 5 to 15% of what the parishes take in is returned to the bishop, to the diocese. The more affluent parishes pay more, and those that are on the margins typically pay less. So it is a tax, but most of the money goes to support what the parish needs, whether it's a school, whether it's outreach, Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, all of the various ministries and programs that a parish has. The Vatican financial statement that is posted every summer does not include the Vatican Bank. It is off the books. And so we don't really know how much the Holy See is worth, although they do have a metric ton in gold that is part of their investment. Last year, the Italian, it's a long acronym, it is the financial body of the Italian banking system, impounded $30 million from the Vatican Bank on allegations of money laundering. Now, the money has been returned just within the last 3 weeks, according to the New York Times. What Pope Benedict did was form an oversight board. The problem with the Vatican Bank is that because every country writes its own accounting procedures, the Holy See, which only has 108 acres, nevertheless has its own accounting procedures, and so they do not list the assets of the bank. The Financial Times has reported from Italy that the bank is basically an offshore holding company for certain favored clients. They also hold the assets for religious orders around the world. So where does the money go? The bishops of this country do not have to release financial statements and do not. I'm afraid that's the best answer I can give you. One small footnote, though, Jim, if I may. I did a lot of research on embezzlements. Many of you perhaps have seen news reports of priests or even lay people being prosecuted because of theft or embezzlement. And according to Michael Ryan, who's an authority on this, has studied it for years, since 1965, the church has lost an estimated $2.3 billion in embezzlements because they do not have a fail-safe, system-wide method of counting the collections on Sunday and making sure that the same amount of money gets into the bank on Monday. And just to finish this out, in 1992, when I published Lead Us Not Into Temptation, I said in every talk I gave, op-eds, whenever I could, that this problem of abuse could really be eradicated or dramatically reduced if the bishops would remove every priest who had abused a child. I was told by the General Counsel of the USC, the Bishops' Conference in Washington, that they could not do this because each bishop was autonomous and reported directly to the Pope. In 2002, when the world caved in with all the media coverage growing out of Boston, they met in Dallas, and when they adopted the Youth Protection Charter, they agreed, one strike and you're out. The same thing could be done in counting the collection plate, arguably reducing a $90 million a year loss. But where all the money goes, it starts in the parishes. As the money flows up to higher levels, they can invest, they can donate. The problem now is that we are witnessing a huge downsizing of the American Catholic infrastructure. In the last 15 years, on average, a parish has closed once a week. Part of that is because of the abuse crisis. Part of it is demographic changes. As old neighborhoods change, people move to other neighborhoods. The question of these physical plants is real. And the third problem is basic mismanagement of funds. So when a diocese goes into bankruptcy, or when you have, as in Los Angeles and Chicago, upwards of $100 million in unfunded clergy pension liabilities, it gets back to a question of management.
I'm wondering what kind of formal response you may have gotten from the church, either from Rome or here in America, to your criticisms.
Well, they try to ignore me most of the time. I mean, I really haven't been attacked that much, surprisingly. This book has just been published, so there's been no formal response. Typically what the church does is maintain silence rather than respond directly to factual reporting or opinion, such as those few, like as with Sedano, that I've articulated today.
Has the Internal Revenue taken any position on any of the audits that they've made?
That's a very interesting question about the Internal Revenue Service. To my knowledge, no. And I think part of that has to do with the court's historic view of the separation of church and state. For the IRS to go in and start auditing a diocese or archdiocese means that you're really going after the bishop. And when the courts hold back and decide that a bishop has the authority to control a parish, seize its assets, as I've sketched for you here today, I think the government, the Internal Revenue Service, is reluctant to follow on in. Also, I think there's a big problem in that Congress is, bipolar though it may be these days, Congress is loath to in any way intervene in religious issues of this kind. And if a congressman calls on the IRS, one of the oversight committees, typically in the House, but the Senate could do it as well, that would be like shooting a flare across the bow, and that has not happened yet.
You mentioned Kalamazoo, Boston, and Los Angeles, I think, as the three dioceses that have audited financial statements. And I'm just wondering, are there any other, I'm not sure these are good examples of a silver lining that might exist with these dark clouds looming. Are there any examples that you could cite about effective models of transparency that might be emulated?
Well, Boston is a very interesting case because church attendance has plummeted to about 30%, and there haven't been what you would call surgical opinion polls, but I think the great hope was that when Law resigned, people would feel a sense of relief that O'Malley would come as a healer, and reconfiguration blew up in his face. Having said that, O'Malley has ordered the most transparent financial statements, along with Los Angeles and Kalamazoo. There's a fellow I quote in this book at a number of instances. His name is Jack Ruhl, R-U-H-L. He is a professor of accountancy at Western Michigan, former assistant dean of the business school, and he, for years now, has made a study of diocesan financial statements. And it's his opinion, and I checked this out with other people who are knowledgeable CPAs, that the level of disclosure is so minimal that one can't really understand where the money goes in most dioceses. So I'm sorry there's no more cheerful response to give. But let me just add one thing. That doesn't mean people are stealing from the central fund. What it means is we just don't know how the assets are truly managed. Ellie.
As to your comment about the IRS and other kinds of financial accountability from authorities outside of the church structure, isn't that the same as when the priest scandals first came out, that there was a sense that dioceses or bishops and priests were not accountable to civil or criminal authorities, that you couldn't bring charges, a reluctance to bring, not that you couldn't legally, but there was a reluctance to bring charges against a priest or a bishop in those cases?
Yes, and to follow that analogy, what it would take for the kind of oversight questions that are surfacing here, it would really take legal action. A group of parishioners would have to file suit, or if not file suit, at least demand a full accountability if the bishop didn't do it. And I'm not going around endorsing this, but and if the diocese didn't respond, if there were legal action tends to drive policy, is really the bottom line. I mean, you see that in the healthcare debate today, people filing suit in these different jurisdictions. And I think we're destined to see that in the issue of parish ownership versus closures. The difference between, say, St. James, Kansas, Ohio, and as the court in Springfield ruled. By the way, it's interesting. There are now 5 parishes in Boston, based on the work that Peter Beret has done in Rome, with the Apostolic Signatura, which is in essence the Supreme Court of the Vatican. 5 parishes that have been in vigil now for 7 years that have appeals which have not yet been decided, and there are 15 here in Cleveland. Now, this is both, I'm straying just a tad from your question, but what's interesting about this is that in other parts of the country, Allentown, Pennsylvania, Camden, or other dioceses, what the Signatura has been ruling is rather fascinating. They're telling the bishops, yes, you have the authority to close these churches, but you cannot relegate them from sacred to profane use. Now, this is canonical language, but what it means is you can't sell them. Because if something is relegated to profane use, then it can be sold. So here are some of these bishops now scratching their heads saying, well, okay, I've closed it. I'm having to pay the utility bill. We got to keep the insurance going. The people want in, but I can't close it. Now, he doesn't have to put a pastor in there. But what it's going to take is concerted efforts by the part of people who want information. And the biggest barrier, frankly, as Catholics, we are raised in a culture of passivity, to pray, pay, and obey. I did not create that adage. Sad to say, but as a writer, I genuflect to its reality. Where is the microphone? The gentleman.
Yes, excuse me. A couple times in your presentation there was a reference to the fundraising drive that's underway, the capital campaign here in the Cleveland Diocese. Right. They've also made it known that none of the funds raised are going to go to pay for any of the sexual abuse scandals or any of the legal fees for that. So I have a hypothetical. Suppose you're a parishioner in our diocese, and knowing that and knowing what you know, would you contribute to the campaign?
Why is there always someone like you when I give these talks? No, it is the question. My inclination is never to try to be punitive when it comes to causes that help people in need. If there's some way you can contribute to a specific ministry, soup kitchen, food pantry, something like that, that's important. The thing you'd want to know is whether any of the money is going to the property and casualty fund, because that is how they have paid the abuse settlements in this diocese. And it is not on the financial statement, it's not audited. Yeah. I'm not saying they have used it, I don't know. I mean, the court system in Ohio closed ranks in support of the church on the abuse crisis, unlike California and Massachusetts. So, Father Cousins.
In 1985, writing in the National Catholic Reporter, you broke the clergy sexual abuse scandal. Following that story, or series of stories, I believe you suffered significant criticism, and so did the National Catholic Reporter. I have two parts to my question. How did you survive that attack upon your own integrity and fidelity to the church? And might not something similar happen in light of the publication of your book now, Render unto Rome?
Well, I didn't get the second part about the new book. What?
Well, I think you did something very significant and actually saved numerous children from being abused by breaking that story. That took real moral courage. Money is a little bit less charged than sex, but it's still very central to our lives. Do you think some kind of similar criticism might befall you for writing the current book, Render unto Rome?
Well, in Cincinnati, I did a long interview with the St. Anthony Messenger, and if they get it out soon enough, maybe there won't be as much criticism. You know, I grew up in an environment, when you ask about faith and what it did to me I got called the vulture of yellow journalism in the Daily Advertiser of Lafayette, Louisiana, which is appropriately named. And the weekly paper, I did a long series in '85 in the Times of Acadiana, and those reports ran concurrently in the National Catholic Reporter. And, you know, when the big newspaper attacks you, and its own reporters come up and pat you on the back, listening to a Zydeco band at 11 o'clock at night the next day, you sort of figure you got some people on your side. You know, I was raised I went to Jesuit high school in New Orleans, and we were taught that faith and reason need not collide. And I went on through Georgetown, and the idea of justice as part of the church's inherent character was conveyed to me in any number of ways. And yeah, people took shots at me along the way, pot shots, but my reporting was never challenged. And I worked very hard at that. I spent 7 years on that book, and it's still in print, I might add, although these years later, not making a lot of money, but it's out there. And I worked very hard on the accuracy of this book. So, you know, when you go out with a topic like this, you expect that some people will be displeased and say things, but I try to be reasonable and open to dialogue, and just hope that I don't need more life insurance, you know.
The Diocese of Cleveland has admitted in litigation that it holds the property of the diocese in trust for the benefit of the parishioners, the people of the diocese. Yet the law in Ohio is that those people have no ability to try to enforce that obligation and that trust. The Attorney General of Ohio does have that authority, but in that particular case, the Attorney General joined with the diocese in seeking to dismiss the litigation, and the Attorney General has never taken any action to deal with any of these issues. Are you familiar with any similar situation in any other diocese, anywhere else in the country?
Same thing happened in Boston, in Massachusetts. You know, I think as Americans, we are accustomed to thinking of responses to problems via City Hall, Congress, Governor's Mansion, White House. And the crisis in the church today is one of rapid disintegration from within, a great clamoring for change on the outside, but without the structural mechanisms to bring about the rational reforms that we need. Perhaps at some point a public official, well, we saw the grand jury in Philadelphia indict the Monsignor and several priests. Now, to indict a Monsignor who is essentially in charge of personnel is quite a bold move. I don't know. As I said earlier, I think litigation over property issues will probably be the driving force, but I don't claim to have the answer. Thank you.
Today at the City Club, we have been listening to Jason Berry, author of Render Unto Rome, The Secret Life of Money in the Catholic Church. Thank you, Mr. Berry. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This program is now adjourned.
Nicole.